I'm Graham Towl. I'm Professor of Forensic Psychology. I'm the author of two books on addressing sexual violence at universities and in higher education. And I have over the years had various responsibilities for these areas. Well, I think one of the things to do is to check what the motivations are. So what I mean by that is if someone, from the word go, simply wants to do the right thing and do all they can, then that's a fairly straightforward discussion. If, on the other hand, the motivations are more around educational, arguments around education, how does it improve the educational outcomes, then one could engage in a discussion about making sure that people feel safe and not harassed is what people need before they can benefit fully in terms of education or indeed research. On the other hand, if the motivations are around, the financial flows, and there are concerns in universities about the financial viability sometimes of the institution, then I think the arguments then would be around it's one way of attracting more students to be taking addressing sexual violence and harassment seriously. Well, I think there's a number of bodies. I mean, universities have boards of governors, governing bodies who hold the executive to account. They're the people who appoint the vice chancellors, the people who are the chief executives, effectively, of the institutions. So that's one mechanism for holding the institution to account. There's the QAA that can hold the institution to account. The Office for Students as the regulator. Student unions have, I think, a key role because often their presidents will be members of the governing body, and that's a really important role and impact in this area in terms of giving accountability to the executive team and making sure that they are accountable. And then, of course, there's the Office for Independent Adjudications too. So I think there's various layers of potential accountability in terms of how they're held to account, but fundamentally they're independent institutions and the responsibility lies with them. And in governance terms, it's their governing bodies. And I think their governing bodies need to speak more publicly about this area. I hear very little from governing bodies in this area. I think when governing bodies advertise for governors, I think and instead of simply focusing, as many do, on areas for all sorts of understandable reasons, on experience in business, experience in HR, experience in change management, these sorts of areas, have someone with experience in safeguarding, experience in working with people who've been subjected to sexual violence. There's no reason why governing bodies couldn't recruit people themselves who have expertise in that area, which would then better position them to hold executive teams to account. That, it seems to me, to be where the responsibility and accountability lies, rather than seeing that responsibility and accountability outside the institution, whatever body it is. That's fundamentally where the responsibility and accountability is. Yeah, well, I think with reputational risk, I think that the pendulum is swinging. I think it used to be the case that the issue around reputational risk was whether or not something would get into the media that there'd been a particularly unpleasant incident at an institution. I think the pendulum is swinging now insofar as if institutions are not transparent and talking about these areas and addressing them and doing things, then I think they're far more exposed than if they are. So it used to be they're almost afraid to talk about it in case it got bad publicity. But now I think more mature institutions are having mature discussions with their student unions, with other stakeholders, with the Office for Students, and and building upon the guidance that was sent out by the Office for Students recently. So part of the problem there seems to me to be one that the culture of academia is one that has a tradition of secrecy. So for example, this is at all layers of academia. So for example, if I submit a paper to a journal, I don't know who reviews that. I get the feedback, but I don't know who's reviewed it. So we're used to secrecy. So what I think we need is a more open culture, a more transparent culture, where we're able to say to each other, well, we don't think that paper's quite so good, and we think it needs this change or that change, but we're prepared to put our name to it. I think these are some of the things that need to change in the culture of academia to make higher education better positioned to be more comfortable with transparency. So the parallel is with sexual violence. Again, there's been a tradition of having a bit of a culture of secrecy, but now people are talking. I think that's now long gone. We're now really starting to talk about it far more, and about having that transparency. And in a sense, if we don't talk about a problem, if we don't identify a problem, we're unlikely to be doing the right things to address it. So I think that's really important. So for me now, it seems to me that we've reached a stage where the reputational risk is in not doing anything. That's where the risk is for, the primary risk is for an institution. Because it seems to me that the universities is just uniquely well placed to address sexual violence and harassment, and that's for a number of reasons. One is there's no reason why universities can't make reporting the new norm. Well, if we make reporting the new norm, so people are more likely to come forward if something has happened to them than not, then that might deter a percentage of potential perpetrators. So it might actually contribute to prevention, having a higher reporting level. And there's different levels of reporting. So, for example, there's a form of anonymous reporting where someone says, X has happened in such and such a place, but they don't give their name and they don't give the potential perpetrator's name at all. But we've got some intelligence then. We'll know that something has happened, say, in a particular residential block or a particular area of the university, or indeed outside the university. Then there's another level at which the person might give their own name, but not be willing to give the name of the perpetrator. So then we can collect information on who is it who's reporting these things, who is it who's potentially more likely to be subjected to harassment or whatever. So we start to build up that data. It might be that someone tells us the name, but they say, but I don't want to do any more than get some support for myself. Educationally or personally as well, personal support too, but I don't really want it investigated. Then we start to learn something about perpetrator characteristics too. So at each level, depending upon the information we have, we can learn more, and that can then inform our strategies going ahead. So we can learn things like what are the perpetrator characteristics, but also situational characteristics. Are things worse, say, on a Friday night or on a Saturday night? Is it in particular places? Are there some intersectional aspects to the patterns that emerge in? And it's a really good route into intersectionality to start to see what all these different characteristics of both the environment and the people involved are. I think one of the things I'd focus on is partnerships, because partnerships with other groups can be really important. There's often a lot of expertise both within the organisation. So often universities will look outside for experts, but actually a number of the experts are within their own institutions. So that would be the first place that I would look. What resource do I have in terms of people, who are currently working in the organisation, and what's their expertise? But then to look at our partners. So, for example, there's partners with sexual violence, partners with SARC, sexual assault referral centres, GP practices, a range of partners potentially that we can work with. So that's important, because then it means that we can, share support and share resources potentially too in this area. Because, for example, the SARCs are funded in relation to supporting people who have been subjected to sexual violence. The police are funded in terms of looking at an element of it, looking at sexual crimes and so on. So there are different partners who have funding and resource in this area, and I think we should work with them. And the second thing, on a practical note, is about, again, just relentlessly encouraging reporting. One of the reasons why that's important is because what that demonstrates to a governing body is that there's demand. So I think sometimes a problem can be, if there's a relatively low reporting rate, a governing body would maybe feel uncomfortable about a lot of investment in the area, because they think, well, there isn't that much of a problem maybe. But if we're not addressing these areas and it's a big problem, and we know it's a big problem, then we might have negative impacts on the education outputs and also the research outputs for the institution. So I think those are some of the arguments for prioritising that. Well, I think one thing is being a moral compass for the institution. So, for example, having a policy that staff shouldn't have sex with their students. I mean, that seems to me to be so fundamental and so basic. It's sending a very strong message, it seems to me, about a recognition of those power inequalities and so on, and how those relationships could be, were they to happen, could be open to abuse. And this is really important for prevention. It's the environment in which people are working, and it's the culture. And I think working on the culture is so important, because working on that culture, there's an expectation. For example, I mentioned earlier, there's an expectation that if something happens, it will be reported. If it's reported and the person wants action to be taken, action will be taken. When I say if the person wants action to be taken, I think that's important because we've got to respect the personal autonomy of survivor victims. That seems to me to be fundamental too. And I think that's important therapeutically too, in terms of them recovering and moving on from whatever has happened to them too. To respect that personal autonomy is really important, it seems to me. At a fundamental level, we know that sexual violence is wrong. There's the wherewithal within universities. There are the resources across the sector, from the 1752 group, the book I wrote with Clarissa Humphreys, the book I wrote with Tammy Walker. There's plenty of information and resources there. The test for the sector is, are people willing to use them, and are they bold enough to make the decisions and send out the right messages about the culture, what is and what is not acceptable. I think is one of the biggest barriers to change in this area, people externalizing the problem. The very leaders who are actually, who on the one hand want to say we are autonomous, independent institutions, then sit back for someone else to tell them how to do it. Extraordinary. I mean, I think that is the single biggest barrier to change in the higher education sector in addressing sexual violence. It is leaders almost outsourcing it in that sort of way, saying, well, if only they'd tell us what to do exactly. So for example, one could be a critical friend of the office of students and say, oh, well, look, your statement of expectations, couldn't you have firmed it up or beefed it up a bit more? Well, yeah, of course they could. But you know what? They haven't done a single thing to stop a university addressing this issue. They've done nothing to stop someone saying, you know what, I'm the leader, I'm responsible for this budget, I think this is wrong, I'm going to tackle it. So this externalizing, I think, is a real failure of leadership in truth. In terms of looking at how we could change the sector in a really positive way, I think there are a couple of things that could be done. One of them is for the sector to sign up to a national prevalence study. That's really important. One of the reasons that's important is because then, this is transparency personified. This is the prevalence. This is the prevalence of sexual violence, and we have an authoritative snapshot of the prevalence levels. Really, really important. Because then when we're looking at reporting rates, we can look at the reporting rates in proportion to the prevalence. So if an institution has a very high rate of reporting, but quite low prevalence, that's a positive sign in comparison with an institution which has very, very low reporting levels and very high prevalence levels. So it's the difference between those two we can, in a sense, measure institutions on. And then over time, if we want to know what good looks like is initially having the reporting levels going up, but having the prevalence levels going down year on year. So that's what good looks like, because you've got low prevalence and high reporting. So of those people who've been subjected to sexual violence, a very high proportion of them are reporting. That's what good looks like. Where we are at the moment is high prevalence with very low reporting. That's what bad looks like, and that's where we are. So we need to be on that trajectory of change. And different institutions are at different points. But when I say bad, that's where we are. I'm thinking about across the sector on average. But I mean, that seems to me to be the fundamentals of this. And I don't quite see why we wouldn't do that in a sense, because then we've got the prevalence nailed and we've got the reporting nailed, and institutions have a way of evaluating what they're doing and its effectiveness, which I think is institutions have struggled with. How to evaluate, how do we know we're being effective? We know we're being effective if we're getting prevalence rates down and reporting rates up. That's how we know we're being effective. Then my mantra is always report, because if we report, as long as we respect the personal autonomy of the survivor victim who is reporting, then I think that is a good thing and will help us with prevention in a whole host of different ways.